I'm Andrea Gabor. I'm the Bloomberg Professor of Business Journalism at Baruch College, which is part of the City University of New York. And I am a longtime business and management writer. And years ago, I wrote a book about a man named W. Edwards Deming. And I mention this only because it becomes relevant later on when I start covering education. So how did I make the transition from business and management to education? Well, that all started during the beginning of the Bloomberg administration, during the beginning of his mayoralty here in New York City. When I became interested, I was asked to write an article about the Principals Leadership Academy, which Bloomberg established very early on. And the Principals Leadership Academy was modeled in part on General Electric's vaunted Crotonville management training program, which had recently been renamed after GE's longtime and very controversial CEO, Jack Welch. Now, Jack Welch's nickname was Neutron Jack because he believed that any GE business that wasn't number 1 or 2 in its industry should be slashed, gotten rid of. And he had a similar attitude about, similarly brutal attitude, I should say, about employees. So I go to one of the very first training sessions of the Principals Leadership Academy, and who should be there serving as trainer but Neutron Jack himself. And, I sat there I was just amazed, and I really wanted to know what these educators, not just what is he teaching the educators, but how are they receiving this message from Neutron Jack. So that sort of set me on a path. And once I really started delving into the Bloomberg administration's education policy, what I came to realize was that it was riddled with contradictions. On the one hand, it was a policy full of turmoil, including constant reorganizations and an obsession with tests and accountability. And on the other hand, he was bringing in he was trying to spark sort of new small schools, more innovative small schools. He was promoting very gifted educators who'd been working in New York for decades. He was promoting the idea of school networks, that is, networks of like-minded small schools that could learn from each other. So, lots of turmoil, lots of contradiction. And one of the things that's very important to understand is that in addition to drawing on people like Jack Welch, Bloomberg also drew on New York's very deep bench and history of excellent educators, going back to, for example, Debbie Meyer, the first educator to win a MacArthur Award for work she started doing in the 1970s, sparking small schools, teacher-led schools. New York, that was also the start of the networks of like-minded schools. Again, started years before Bloomberg. These were very progressive schools. They were bottom-up, teacher-led schools, and Bloomberg drew on many of those people and promoted them into his administration. But one of the things that I soon discovered was that always, no matter how talented and excellent the educators were, Bloomberg never completely trusted the educators. Deming would have trusted the educators, and we'll get into that in a moment. He trusted the business people above all else. And a great example of that was what happened to the Principals Leadership Academy. So there had been the other great inspiration for the Academy was a long-standing progressive effort to train principals, of which a woman named Sandra Stein was one of the leaders. And Sandra Stein's work had dated back for years, and Bloomberg brings Sandra Stein into the Principal's Leadership Academy as number 2, as the second most important executive. But as CEO, they bring in a mediocre business executive who had previously run a failed telecommunications company. Now, the mediocre business executive lasts for all of about 2 years, and Sandra Stein finally ends up getting promoted. But it was a really clear indication to me that the business guys in the Bloomberg administration, no matter how mediocre they were or how sort of out of touch with public education, were always going to kind of have first dibs. They were always going to be the most respected individuals. And that lesson really got driven home 10 years into the Bloomberg administration when his longtime chancellor, Joel Klein, resigned. Now, Joel Klein was a very controversial figure, but he was there for 10 years. And of course, that's 10 years in which lots of very gifted, longtime educators had risen up in the ranks in the Bloomberg administration. And so the question was, who was Bloomberg going to appoint to replace Joel Klein? And what did Bloomberg do? He didn't appoint any of those gifted educators. He reached into the business community and appointed a publisher who had absolutely no experience whatsoever in public education. She lasted all of about a couple of months. He then had to sideline her, bring in a sort of a placeholder chancellor for the last 2 years. And so in the last 2 years of his administration, he completely squandered any opportunity to really cement some of the better things that had happened during his administration. So the one important thing to remember is that Bloomberg had 12 years to achieve some change. And you know, what happened when Bill de Blasio was elected mayor, and of course de Blasio immediately swung the pendulum completely toward more bureaucracy, more compliance, et cetera, was that there was no one, there were no groups who would stand up and say, no, this isn't right. We have a great system in place. And no one really fought back against this. And one of the reasons is that and this was a subtext of the 12 years of the Bloomberg administration, and by the way, every business-driven education reform movement since then, is that enemy number one was the teachers' union. So even as the Bloomberg administration didn't trust the educators, it fought constantly with the teachers' union. And so there was no constituency to fight back against de Blasio, many of de Blasio's very wrong-headed education policies. And so what happened within about a year? De Blasio gets rid of the Principal's Leadership Academy. He shuts down most of the networks. He imposes compliance. So one of the things Bloomberg had done was give principals a lot of autonomy, including control over their budgets. That all went by the wayside, and he even closed down many excellent small schools. Okay, so the tragedy of the Bloomberg administration is that after 12 years, de Blasio was able to wipe the whole thing out within a year or two, precisely because Bloomberg hadn't built trust with educators.